Late one evening, a 22-year-old university student, Ethan Clark, quietly made his way home after working an exhausting shift at a local restaurant. Juggling his studies and part-time jobs, he was doing everything he could to care for his mother, who had been confined to a wheelchair after a stroke. Despite his exhaustion, when he saw an elderly man struggling with a malfunctioning electric wheelchair, he couldn't walk past. Within moments, Ethan had expertly fixed the chair, to the old man's surprise. He waved off any thanks, smiling humbly, and continued on his way, unaware that this simple act would have a profound impact on his future. Ethan's alarm rang loudly at 5:30 a.m., just like it had every day for the last 3 years. The 22-year-old engineering student groggily rolled out of bed in his tiny apartment, where he lived with his mother, Diane. He carefully stepped over the clutter of textbooks and tools that littered the floor, making sure not to wake her. Diane was already stirring in the other room. Ethan slipped on his worn boots and grabbed his faded backpack, patched up with duct tape. It held his textbooks, a thermos of homemade coffee, and his prized tool kit, the tools he had carefully bought one by one with his delivery job earnings. "Good morning, Mom," Ethan whispered as he entered her room. Diane was already trying to lift herself from bed into her wheelchair. The creaky manual chair groaned under her weight, its wheels worn from years of use. She had been in that chair for nearly 8 years after a car accident that had changed their lives. "You don't have to whisper, honey. I'm up," Diane called back, her voice still strong despite the weariness in her eyes. "Did you eat breakfast?" Ethan asked, though both knew the answer. There was rarely enough for a proper meal when rent was due next week. "I'll grab something at school." Diane reached out to adjust the collar of his shirt, her hands trembling slightly from the side effects of her medication. "Are you sure you can't skip your delivery job tonight? You look exhausted," she asked softly. Ethan knelt next to her, meeting her eyes. "We've been over this, Mom. I need the extra hours for the therapy bills. They don't pay themselves." He forced a smile, trying to hide his own fatigue. "Besides, I like the delivery job. It gives me time to think about my engineering projects." What he didn't say was that every time he watched her struggle with her chair, fighting to push it over ramps or deal with broken wheels, it hurt him deeply. That pain fueled his desire to build something better, not just for her, but for everyone who needed it. "I love you," Diane said, her voice thick with emotion. "Love you too, Mom," Ethan whispered, kissing her forehead before grabbing his bag and heading for the door. The morning passed in a blur of lectures and lab work. When Ethan's phone buzzed with a new delivery order, he had a brief moment to grab lunch before his evening shift at Tony's Auto Repair. As he sped through downtown on his old motorcycle, he saw him. An elderly man sat at the bottom of a steep hill, looking helpless in his malfunctioning electric wheelchair. The man's silver hair gleamed under the late afternoon sun, but his shoulders trembled slightly, whether from cold or frustration, Ethan couldn't tell. Without a second thought, he pulled over and jogged across the street. "Hey, you all right?" Ethan called out, approaching the old man. The elderly man looked up, his sharp eyes meeting Ethan's. Despite his apparent age, there was a clarity in his gaze, though his expression was one of embarrassment. He wore a perfectly pressed button-down shirt and slacks, clearly well-to-do, and Ethan could tell from his attire that he likely had more wealth than Ethan would ever see. "I'm afraid I'm having some trouble with this thing," the old man said, his voice trembling. "It just stopped on me right here, of all places." He gestured at the steep hill ahead. Ethan crouched beside the wheelchair, his trained eye immediately assessing the situation. "Mind if I take a look? I'm studying mechanical engineering, and I also work on cars and bikes. I might be able to help." As he examined the wheelchair's control panel, Ethan noticed an error code flashing. "What exactly's happening?" he asked. The old man sighed, looking helpless. "It just died, and this screen is showing these weird numbers. I don't know what they mean." Ethan recognized the issue immediately, a motor controller failure, probably triggered by an overheating safety system. But what stood out to him more was the wheelchair's design. It was sleek, sophisticated, and unlike anything he had ever seen. "This is strange," Ethan muttered, inspecting the intricate components. "This wheelchair isn't like the typical ones. The engineering here is pretty advanced." The old man's eyes narrowed. "Is that important for fixing it?" Ethan smiled. "Actually, yeah. Most wheelchairs have a simple reset procedure, but this one, well, let me show you." He carefully removed a small access panel and located the thermal sensor. This system's more complex. The motor overheated, which triggered a safety lock. But I think I can reset it for now. The old man watched, wide-eyed, as Ethan bypassed the thermal lockout and reset the motor controller. The wheelchair came back to life with a soft hum. Ethan adjusted a few more components, fine-tuning the cooling system to ensure it didn't overheat again on any future inclines. This should help with the airflow, Ethan said as he stood up, brushing his hands off. But just so you know, the motor's still prone to overheating if you go up another steep hill. The system will shut down again. The elderly man looked at Ethan in amazement. How did you know to do that? He asked, his voice filled with awe. Ethan shrugged casually. Like I said, I study this stuff. Plus, my mom's been in a wheelchair for years, so I've learned how to fix almost anything that goes wrong with them. He paused, thinking about all the late nights he'd spent researching wheelchair technology. I've never seen anything as advanced as this, though. What's your name, son? The man asked, extending his hand. Ethan Clark, Ethan said, shaking his hand. And no thanks are necessary. I'm just happy I could help. Clark. I see. The old man mused, nodding thoughtfully. You're one of the rare few who still believe in helping others without wanting anything in return. I'm Samuel Whitaker. Mr. Whitaker, Ethan said, smiling and backing away toward his motorcycle. It was my pleasure. Take care. As Ethan revved his bike and rode off into the evening traffic, the image of Samuel Whitaker's stunned face stayed with him. There had been something more than gratitude in the old man's eyes, recognition, maybe, as if Samuel had seen something in Ethan that Ethan himself hadn't yet discovered. Back at his apartment, Ethan tucked his phone away, unaware that Samuel was dialing a number, a new plan starting to form in his mind. Of course, sir. Elaine responded on the other end, but Samuel was already lost in thought, staring down at the prototype. The more he thought about Ethan, the more convinced he became that their paths had crossed for a reason. It was well past midnight when the file arrived. Elaine had always been precise and efficient, and Samuel couldn't help but admire her attention to detail. He flipped open the folder, his heart sinking as he read through the pages. Ethan Clark, raised by a single mother, a mechanic's apprentice, balancing school and part-time jobs. Medical bills piling up. A modest, hard-working life. Samuel paused at the faded newspaper clipping inside the folder. It was a photo of Ethan's mother, Diane, younger but clearly the same woman he had seen in the apartment the day before. Samuel's chest tightened as he read the article's headline. Local woman injured in car accident. He closed the folder, his mind racing with thoughts of his own son, Nathan, who had grown up spoiled and entitled in comparison. Samuel had thrown money at problems, believing wealth could shield his family from pain, but the gap between them had only grown wider. Now, here was this young man, working 2 jobs and struggling to keep his mother alive, yet showing a depth of character Samuel hadn't expected. By the time the sun was rising, Samuel was no closer to figuring out what to do next. He was deeply moved by Ethan's resilience, and it wasn't just the young man's skill that impressed him. It was his integrity, his quiet strength, and the way he carried himself despite all the burdens he faced. Samuel had spent decades building an empire, yet here was a young man whose potential far surpassed anything money or fame could buy. Elaine, Samuel said the following morning, voice firm but thoughtful. I want his address. I'll be paying him a visit. Elaine hesitated. Sir, perhaps it would be wiser to contact him formally. Extend an invitation to meet at the company. Keep it professional. Samuel shook his head, his decision final. This isn't about business. This is something personal. Elaine nodded slowly, sensing the gravity in his voice. Samuel sat at his desk, staring at the address on the paper in front of him. A modest apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. It was the kind of place Samuel hadn't seen in years. He had become so accustomed to the plush surroundings of his business empire that he couldn't remember the last time he had seen a neighborhood like this. He felt a flicker of nervousness in his stomach, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't about business meetings or investor negotiations. This was different. This was about meeting someone who, despite everything stacked against him, had something special. The driver was already waiting outside when Samuel stepped into the car. But Samuel didn't rush. He sat still, contemplating the weight of the decision in his hands. Today, he wasn't going to another business meeting. He was walking into the life of someone who had just shown him what true dedication looked like. The city whizzed past him as he made his way to Ethan's apartment, his heart pounding in anticipation. Samuel reached the apartment complex, a far cry from the polished buildings he was used to. He stood there for a moment, collecting his thoughts before he knocked on the door. He wasn't sure what he expected to find on the other side, but he knew one thing. This wasn't just another visit. This was a chance to do something that might change both of their lives forever. Ethan opened the door, surprise flickering across his face when he saw Samuel in the hallway. "Mr. Whitaker?" Ethan said, his voice a mix of confusion and disbelief. Samuel smiled faintly. "May I come in?" Ethan hesitated, looking back over his shoulder at his mother, who was in the other room. But he stepped aside, allowing Samuel to wheel himself inside. The small apartment was cozy but lived in, filled with signs of a family that had seen better days. The wheelchair beside Diane's bed was old and in need of repair. Stacks of bills were scattered across the coffee table, reminders of the struggle they faced every month. "Good evening, Mrs. Clark," Samuel said politely, giving a small bow of respect. Diane nodded, but her expression was wary, unsure of this unexpected visitor. "I'm Samuel Whitaker," he continued. "I wanted to speak with you both." Ethan crossed his arms, unsure of what was going on. "Why? You came all the way out here just to thank me again?" Samuel shook his head. "No. I came here because you solved a problem for me that had my best engineers stumped for months. And I've seen enough to know you're fighting battles no one should fight alone." The room went quiet. Diane, who had been cautiously watching, seemed to sense the weight of Samuel's words. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond. "I don't know what you mean," Ethan said slowly, his voice guarded. Samuel leaned forward slightly in his wheelchair, his expression steady. "What I mean is this. I'm offering you something more than gratitude. I believe you have the skills, the drive, and the vision to do something great. And I want to give you the opportunity to reach that potential." Ethan blinked, his brow furrowing. "What are you saying?" "I'm offering you a full scholarship," Samuel said plainly. "Your tuition, your fees, covered in full. And when the semester ends, a place as an intern at Whitaker Mobility." Ethan's eyes widened. He stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. "Why me?" he asked. "I'm just a guy who fixed your chair." Samuel looked at him, his gaze piercing. "No, you're not just a guy. You're someone who understands not just the mechanics, but the purpose behind what we do. You didn't just fix a chair. You solved a problem that's been plaguing us for months, and you did it without asking for anything in return." Ethan's chest tightened. He glanced at his mother, whose eyes were filled with surprise and disbelief. This wasn't the kind of thing they ever dreamed of. Samuel's words lingered in the air, heavy with possibility. "I need time to think about it," Ethan said, his voice shaky but firm. Samuel nodded, understanding. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But know this. I've seen enough to know that you have a gift, and it deserves to be nurtured." As Samuel turned to leave, Ethan stood silently in the doorway, his heart heavy with a mix of excitement and uncertainty. He had never imagined a day like this, a stranger offering him a chance at a future he had only dared to dream about. Samuel's driver waited outside, but Samuel paused just before he entered the car. He looked back at the apartment complex one last time, his eyes narrowing in thought. Something had shifted today. This wasn't just a simple offer. It was the beginning of a new chapter. The door closed behind him as he drove off, leaving Ethan standing there, looking out at a future that was suddenly wide open.